Hello Year 7, welcome to the second lesson in Native Americans. The first one was all about how we tell tribes apart. Now some people got a little confused by that, so just briefly to explain. European settlers, people coming to the Americas, tried to use their language or language groups and their biome to work out what the tribes were, because mainly they didn't bother about what the locals thought themselves. As good historians, we recognize A, that there are problems in doing this, and B, that it's often better to listen to the tribes themselves and hear what they had to say about how they did it. Now, there was a source on the last piece of work that explained how they did this. I interviewed a Native American in Michigan who, well, I say Native American, he was 1/8 Native American, but that's about all you're going to get these days. And he explained to me the house and the clan and the family system. And we'll talk more about that later in the course. So if that's the case, why did I start talking about European settlers? Why even include them in the Native Americans that I started with? Why include that as a tribal group? And I did, I totally did. I put a Puritan in there, I don't know if you noticed. What is the importance of these settlers? Surely, like most history, we can just go straight to source. It's what we did in the Civil War. We talked about the people on both sides. We talked about how it affected people in the 1600s. And to do that, we used letters and written evidence and images from the time to work out how they thought. So why don't we do the same with Native Americans? Why make the point that people at the time didn't? We're historians. Can't we just ignore that? Say they did that and then move on? Why bother with that? And the reason is, well, as you probably gathered where I'm going with this, the reason is a little bit more complicated. And in order to sort of deal with that complication, what we have to do is, well, how do we gather evidence as historians? What do we look at? Now, ordinarily, these lessons would take place after you've been to Lincoln. And at Lincoln, we'd look at Lincoln Castle. Thank you to those of you that have provided your guides already. They have been really interesting to read. I hope you're looking forward to going to visit. So you'd think I'd use Lincoln Castle. You'd be wrong. I'm going to use Beaumaris. Why? Because no one I know has been there. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. I don't know. But for the moment, I can assume you haven't, I think. If we wanted to know about Beaumaris Castle, or indeed any castle, like Lincoln Castle, I reckon there are 4 areas, 4 things as historians that we could look at to learn more about it. So if you want to do this, what evidence can we gain to learn about Beaumaris Castle? I reckon there are 4. Can you come up with all 4? If you're going to play along, pause the video now and come up with your 4. I think that's long enough for you to pause. And if you haven't already, yes, talking to you, Henry, then do so. But I'm going to ramble and then I'm going to give the answer. So what are the 4 things? Here I have them drawn as a castle because, yeah, all right, I like playing with PowerPoint is my point. The first one is the most obvious one. Indeed, thank you, rhetorical student, yelling at the screen right now. It is, of course, the castle itself. We can go and see it. It's right there in front of you. You can see the building. Well, when circumstances allow, you can go and visit. And when circumstances allow, you can go visit Lincoln Castle for much the same reason. You can literally see what's there. Now, I am a frustrated architectural historian. What I do is I walk past houses, I walk past buildings, and I can't help myself but A, look up. That's always an interesting thing in shops and in towns. And B, when I'm looking up, I look at lines in the brickwork where windows have been replaced or where walls have changed, where bricks have been replaced as well. And you look at those and you can kind of see the history of the building in what's happened to it over time. And sometimes it can reveal quite a lot. So if you go to the castle itself, you can see in the brickwork, in the stonework, where things have changed, and you can work out why and for what reason, simply by how it's been done, when it was done, and the styles they use, because styles change over time. And so you can learn a lot from the physical remains of the castle itself. The next thing is anything else you find whilst you're looking around the castle. Now, Beaumaris I chose for another reason. You'll notice it's not surrounded by a town. Much of the land around the outside is still agricultural and therefore reasonably undisturbed. So it's relatively easy to pick up artifacts that were thrown out of the castle. These are things that people in the castle didn't want anymore. They're bits of rubbish. They're things that are broken. But what they throw away and how much of it there is tells us a lot about what's going on in the castle itself. So if you find a whole bunch of broken crockery, you can see what they were eating from. and some idea about what they considered important and what wasn't important. You can see where they've repaired it or not. You can see where they've what was in some of these containers before they were thrown away. That's always a fascinating one. Or you find things like nails that indicate they're doing joinery or some kind of woodwork, and the type of nail and the size of nail will give you the size and the type of joinery that's taking place. You can find evidence of what they ate in terms of animal bones or pollen that gets trapped in the mud. You can see whether or not there was a moat, and so on and so forth. These other artifacts, things that you can find, things that may still be in situ, like, I don't know, an old tapestry, for example. These things will tell you about life inside the castle. They'll tell you what the people were doing there at different points. So you've got the castle itself, it tells you how the castle changed and its physical remains. You've got other things that are not the castle that can be found around it that are really helpful to understand what people are doing within that castle. And that's arguably the most important thing. The third one is medieval books. People write about stuff. And in the medieval era, and then the reason for choosing Beaumaris Castle is important in the medieval era, people write down what was going on. So you can find accounts of people staying in the castle. You can find receipts and things of what was bought for the castle when the castle was built. And you can find books of people that describe passing the castle. And that's always interesting to work out what they saw about it at the time. So medieval books, books from the time, really helpful. And the final thing, of course, is modern books, stuff written by historians that have taken all the other information into account and then given you an account about what the castle is doing and how it changes. So when you were researching Lincoln Castle and Lincoln Cathedral and Steep Hill, you will have read modern sources. You'll have read people that have researched it, looked at all the other information and put it in one place. Largely, from the looks of things, places like Wikipedia. Nothing wrong with Wikipedia, just be careful to back it up. So those are your 4 areas to gather evidence. And as historians, it's good if we can use as many areas as we possibly can, because then we can learn more about the past and how people saw it at the time, which I'd argue is the most important thing. It's not a case of working out when things happened and why things happened. The why things happened is fascinating. It's also worth looking at how people saw it and trying to understand their way of life. That ultimately, to me, is what makes history so engaging and so interesting. And now I'm getting geeky, so I'll move on. Then we come to North American Indians. Wait, what? I called them Native Americans before. Why have I used the term Indians? Well, one, I nicked this from a colleague of mine, no longer at the school. And 2, in fact, they were never at this school. It was another school I used to work at. And 2, the person that discovered the North American continent, a man called Christopher Columbus, was an idiot and thought he discovered India. I'm not joking. So Indians. Now, it's a worksheet. And what I'm going to do is I attached a version of the worksheet, not this PowerPoint, just the worksheet, to the Show My Homework. So you could use that by printing it off in color or in black and white. It really doesn't matter. As you'll see, it's one I used, but it wasn't one I originally made. I've sort of monkeyed with it. Or, if you prefer, you can pause this video at relevant points and carry out the different questions. And that's perfectly accessible and perfectly fine. And I warmly encourage you to do so if that's your way of doing things. It is a video. You can go backwards and forwards as much as you like. Why you would when I'm looking at the camera, I don't know. Source A, let's start there. It's written by a modern historian, and I know that because I met the modern historian who wrote it. And he said the following: there are a number of problems with evidence that make it hard for historians to understand the Indians, note the term, old way of life. The Indians had no written language. European settlers did not fully understand their beliefs and lifestyle. Indian homes were made of buffalo skin and wood, and their tools were of wood and bone. Later, white settlers came either to despise, that's a good word, look it up, the Indians, or to make them heroes. Others wanted to find excuses for stealing the Indians' land. So right from the get-go, you've got an idea about how the natives were seen and the fact that this historian still refers to them as Indians, when I pointed out that that's because an idiot discovered somewhere and thought he discovered India, not a brand new continent. His maths was wrong. He thought the world was smaller than it was. That's why people didn't support Christopher Columbus, not because they didn't think the world was round. People have thought the world was round since ancient Greek times. So there are a number of problems here about why we as historians can't interpret the evidence. And one of the questions on that worksheet will be to go through in bullet points what those problems are based on the quotes. So, for example, you might pick out one quote and you might say something like, oh, buffalo skin and wood are their homes. That is a definite quote. Okay. So why is that a problem? Why can't historians learn something from that? And the clue that I'll give you is, well, think how long these things have to survive in the ground. Source B is a photograph. Now, the quality of photograph is awful, so I couldn't make it too much bigger than it is on this worksheet, and I apologize. But the interesting thing isn't really the photograph. Though if you look at the photograph, you'll see there's somebody posing for a photograph. There's a man dressed as a Native American. He appears to be a Native American. Spoiler alert, he is. And a teepee. More on that in a moment. And it's clearly not on the plains, and it's clearly not one he lives in. Because you can see behind him, there's a massive building and a car. I don't know if you spotted the car. It's a modern photograph. So if you look at the provenance, the bit at the bottom there, it tells you where the photograph is from, and that can really help us understand what we're going to do with this. And it says it's a photograph from an American tourism website advertising a kind of lofty Indian village, part of an Indian reservation. Reservations are places which were set up by white Americans for Indians to live their way of life on. This particular one is outside of a casino, which doesn't sound like a typically Native American thing to do based on what we've learned so far. Something is going on here. Source C is a photograph of a Plains Indian's home. Their teepee, note the spelling. You can spell it T-E-P-E-E, but I prefer this spelling because it's fewer letters. From 1895. Also, most natives spell it this way, so I'm going to go with that. Surviving natives. This is interesting. Photographs are always good, but I've talked before about photographs and how they work. Photographs count which way you're facing and where you put your frame for a photograph and what you decide to look through on that frame. So at the moment, you've got a frame of my eyes and I'm looking right at you. You could have a frame of my mouth as I'm talking. You could have a frame of the quote over here. Oh, I'll have to make it bigger. And you wouldn't notice that I was sat next to it. Or you could have a frame over that way and have Lenin in it. You get the idea. The point is, you decide what to frame. So the interesting thing about photographs isn't whether or not they can be faked. They can totally be faked, by the way. But whether or not they are, well, who's taking the photograph and what they're trying to show. Now, we can be reasonably certain, given that it's a photograph, that it's not taken by Native Americans themselves. Whoever took this photograph was probably white and probably a settler, or at least descended from settlers, and probably wanted to show something particular about what he's showing. Furthermore, there's other pieces of evidence that as you do more of this, you'll come back to and go, oh, because this is an interesting photograph. Source D is a description by a man called Colonel Dodge, who used to work for the United States Army in 1877. And he says the following: the teepee is unusually cold and is usually in cold weather too full of smoke to be bearable to anybody but an Indian. In this small crowded space, there are often crowded 8 to 10 people. Since all the cooking, eating, living, and sleeping are done in this one room, it soon becomes incredibly filthy. Because of course he does. He also famously said, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. I wonder if that colours the sorts of things that Colonel Dodge is going to say in 1877 in the middle of a great Indian war. Source E, and I do apologise, I've kept changing font, I've just realised, I'm usually better at this with fonts, was by Chief Flying Hawk of the Oglala Sioux, and he was speaking in 1905. Now, that's quite late on. By this point, Native Americans are not living on the plains and mostly are living on reservations, forced onto them in most cases through war and conflict by white Americans. So there's an element of nostalgia here. And he says the following: the teepee is a much, I can't do their accents because I don't know what they sound like. The teepee is a much better place to live in than a house. The square brackets there are added. It's an additional piece of information. Always clean in winter, cool in summer, easy to move. Nobody can be in good health if he does not have all the time fresh air, sunshine, and good water. If the Great Spirit wanted men to stay in one place, he would have made the world stay still. And you get a feel for what their way of life must have been like. These people are what we call nomadic. They follow their food. More on that later. So, source C, you get an idea about their views. Now I'm going to get rid of my face for the next bit. Source F is a famous painting of a battle called the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Little Bighorn is a river that flows to the Bighorn River, because this is a littler one. And it was painted in 1876. Now, the white American that painted this scene was not present at the battle. For reasons that will become obvious later in the course, he couldn't have been. And it focuses, and I don't know if you can see this, on the white Americans fighting the battle. The scene is here. It's called Custer's Last Stand. And at the center of the picture is General Custer. And around him are the devilish Indians, whereas the American soldiers shown almost heroically fighting to the last man and the last bullet. That same battle was also drawn, oh flip, there's a lot of spelling errors here, I do apologize, was also drawn by Black Elk, who happened to be there. It's a bit of a different one, isn't it? Very different style. And the task, it says rough books. I don't know why I've put that there. Basically, don't worry about neatness. The important thing here is to make sense of the tasks and to write out your answers in full and explain them. Yes, Marco, to explain them. Expand as much as you can, Alfie, so that I can fully appreciate and understand what you're trying to say, Mercedes. So, sorry for the shout outs. I don't know, maybe it's fun. I don't know. There are 4 tasks here. Now, if you want to pause the video at this point and use this because you can't print off the worksheet at home and you don't have access to a computer and you can do it on your smartphone, please feel free. Otherwise, let's go through the tasks one by one. Source A goes through these tasks. It says here, bullet as many evidence problems as you can find in source A. That means write them out in bullet points. They don't have to be full sentences. Can you see why this is the case? And for each one, just tell me why it's a problem. So I told you one already. Can you find others? I reckon there are 1, 2, 3, 4 and a half reasons why it's difficult to learn about Native Americans in that one source. So aim for 4 bullet points, 5 if you're really feeling clever, and briefly explain why they are problems. Use the quote if you want to, and then tell me why it's a problem. That's all. Don't need to have huge amounts of stuff in there, just that. Task 2 says, okay, why does source B shows it's hard to find out about Indians' old way of life now? Now remember, it's a modern photograph, and it's a person who's clearly a native posing for a camera with a teepee. Is that not how natives lived? But I did point out some problems. And also look at the provenance, the Provenance. Where does the photograph come from? What does it purport to show? What is it being used to do? What is the purpose of this photograph? And it might explain, I reckon, there's what they're trying to do with the photograph, the purpose, and the photograph itself, the content. There are 2 ways in which you can explain, using this meant that, why it's hard to find out about Indians' old way of life now. Question 3 says, how and why, note that, and why are sources D and E different? Now, how is obvious. You look at what they say, and you can quite easily point out they're saying very different things about the same thing, the teepee. They're saying very different things about the teepee. And you can probably draw a number, I reckon about 4, of key differences between the 2. Now, it's not spot the difference, but if you play spot the difference, I guess you're doing the how. The why, well, I wonder. I tarried for a moment when I was going through these sources. I don't know if you noticed, go back in the video if you can't remember, to explain who was writing them and a little bit about them. And you might be able to use that to explain why they have such different views of a teepee. Same question, different source material. How and why are sources F and G different? They're both drawings. Well, one of them is a painting, I suppose, but it started out as a drawing. They're both artwork, there we go, that works, of the same event. They don't really differ in terms of what they suggest about that event. So how are they different? And why do you think they are different? And again, I've given you a hint with the provenance, the Provenance. Neither of them are lies. They're all truth, according to what they have to say. But sir, you haven't mentioned one of the sources. Source C hasn't turned up in a single thing. Ah, thank you, rhetorical student. One of the things we do as historians when we're using source material is that we make connections between different sources, whether or not we're told to use them. Source C is there to help you explain problems in source B and perhaps also to explain the differences and why they differ the way they do in question 3, too. You might also find it helpful when talking about the problems in source A. It could be useful to you in many ways. On its own, very useful, very interesting case. But can you use it in what we call cross-referencing, using two sources together to make a point? Don't worry if you can't. It's not specifically mentioned in any of those. It's a high-level skill. If you can do it, that is amazing. Alrighty then. I forgot to turn the video on. Oh no! It's a lovely field though, isn't it? It's a lovely photograph. Anyway, I'm going to ask you to pause the video at this point whilst you go away and do that worksheet. Are you done? Are you sure? Just in case. You do realize it's on YouTube, therefore your browser will remember where you're up to. So if you stop the video at this point and go away and do the worksheet, you can come back at another point with the same logon and you'll come to the same point on the video. It'll be remembered for you by the internet. So go away and do that now. Okay, I'm assuming those of you that are here now have actually done the worksheet, and therefore you will know enough to do this next section. Now the next section I promised in the show my homework is a true and false quiz, or true or false quiz, I suppose. It can't be true and false. That wouldn't make any sense. Anywho, here it is. You think you know all about it, eh? Then let's see. True or a false? Is it the truth or a lie? First statement. Is it true or a lie? All historians have the same problems with evidence, regardless of who they are studying or studying. Is that true or lies? It is, of course, a lie. Depending on what you're studying, depends on the types of evidence that you're going to be using, and therefore will depend on what evidence problems there are. Alrighty, next statement. It is easy for historians to find out how the North American Indians, should say Native Americans, lived in the past. Is that the truth or is it false? It is, of course, a lie, because it's not easy at all. There's no written records to explain why they did what they did. A lot of what they did leave behind has rotted away or been lost, and they're nomadic. They move around. Therefore, we don't really know where to start digging archaeologically to find out their way of life, because they move so much. So just digging randomly won't get you very far. The United States and the country that they used to inhabit is a bit big. All right. A lot of evidence about the North American Indians has now disappeared. Truth or lies? Yeah, I just explained that. It's clearly the truth. Obviously, it's the truth. That's not even hard. Alrighty. We know a lot about what happened at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Ooh, now this is an interesting one. I did show you two images and I did hint about some things, but does that mean we know a lot or a little? This one's difficult. Maybe you need to go back and have a look at those portraits. Do have a look and look at your answers about how and why they are different. Then you're going to have to work on that and think about, okay, who knows a lot? So we know a lot about what happened at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Is it true or false? It is, of course, false, because the people who were there and who actually survived and did not die in the Battle of Little Bighorn were the natives, who were later killed. And they didn't talk about it very much. And the only picture we have was drawn after the fact. Fascinating. Alrighty, last one. Many white Americans held biased views about the Indians. Now, if you know anything about my views on the word biased, you already know the answer to this question. However, bias can be positive as well as negative bias. Some people, well, let's see. Do white Americans hold biased views? True or false? It is, of course, true. Some people are still very racist about it and talk in terms of civilization, and other people really like the Indians a little bit too much. I call them the Indians very deliberately in that point, and raise them up in places they don't really belong. That's not to say anything bad about the natives themselves. They're lovely people, well, the ones I've met anyway. I'm sure they all are. But the idea of saying that they're better than we are, is itself problematic as well, because what does that actually mean? They certainly have a lot of advantages, by the way. So, you've now done a true or false quiz. You have a score out of 5. Please feel free to share that. It was lovely when you shared your scores about the Armada back war, whatever that was, immediately after the Easter holidays. Goodness me, we're nearly at the end of the year. So I hope this has been useful. Hang on, is that the end? Yeah, here it is. Here's the worksheet. Oh, flip. Yeah, if you're going to pause it here, you probably don't want to see my face. There it is again, just in case you need it. If you have been, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully this has been useful to you. There will be, of course, hang on, there's 2 more weeks. There'll be more lessons on the natives. I'm looking forward to them. You can probably tell it's one of my favorite topics. I will record those and make sure they're up and running. I hope you're all doing well in lockdown. Please feel free to get in contact via the comments. If you're not submitting work, just feel free to get in contact. It's always nice to hear from you. You are, after all, my Year 7s. I'm my favorite Year 7 set. My only Year 7 set. Have a lovely day. Enjoy the weather, though I think it's going to rain later, isn't it? And I shall see you around, and you'll see me in the next video, of course. And by now, I'm going to end with what has become traditional for most people that watch my videos, but you guys don't know this yet, which is the awkward pause ending.